Viking raids explained in 10 minutes or less. Start off before going into the actual raid itself, it's important for us to understand what influenced the act of raiding. Norse people believed that theft was an act that permitted a man to an eternity of torment after death. However, raiding, on the other hand, was a more mature, more honorable act. Raiding was a symbol of an honorable challenge to a fight in which the victor retains all of the spoils. So basically, raiding was another form of theft, but the Norse kind of took that, changed it into a more valid reason to perform these acts, and that is something that influenced them heavily. It's important to understand that Vikings were normal people. They were farmers, they were traders, they lived in small villages, which poverty was a big thing. And that's what influenced the act of pirating, the act of Viking raids, because Viking raids and pirating, there is a similar connection there. Viking status was heavily influenced. So raiding was believed to increase a man's status in the Viking society, because they would return with wealth and, most importantly, fame. These two things assisted heavily in climbing the social ladder within the Viking society. Raiding was a form of a part-time occupation, essentially another way of generating income and various other loot. They needed loot because Vikings had ships. Vikings used ships as an easy way to put loot on. So within a pillage, Vikings would often analyze the loot around them and take what they can that is compact enough to fit on these ships. And within doing this act, slavery became another easy and fast mechanism for them. They would enter the village, grab whatever they can that can be capable of being on a ship, and slaves were one of the things that brought a lot of income. They could sell slaves, they could use slaves. So villages served as a means of transport, in a sense that they could get slaves easily, as well as gold and various other types of loot. Moving into the more tactical side of Viking raids, it's important for us to understand the tactical maneuver that they had to use in order to have a successful raid. Which brings us into the first and most important part of raiding, ships. Ships were extremely essential for every Viking raid, and Vikings were famous for having some of the best designed fast ships at the time. Vikings' ships were designed in such a way that it made it possible for them to easily enter sandy beaches because of the bottom of the ship that made it a really fast and easy maneuver for them. Contemporary ships, Viking ships, ships in general, they were an important part and maneuver of tactical warfare within Viking raids. Ships Vikings relied heavily on. The Viking ships were especially designed to board sandy beaches much more easily and much more efficiently, while a contemporary ship was unable to board a sandy beach without the need of a harbor. This is what made Viking ships superior. Vikings traveled in small bands on these ships, being able to fastly maneuver out onto land, raid the village, and quickly come back. This is what made ships such an important vessel for Vikings. Ships allowed them to board lands, to do looting and pillaging as fast as possible, and take what they can on the ship with them and return back to their farmland. The element of surprise was a very efficient tactic for Vikings. Vikings were far more different than the average armies back in that era. Vikings did not rely on time. Instead, they relied on surprise attacks, infiltrating the enemy when the enemy doesn't know. This is what made most of the Viking raids ironically successful. They did not rely on time, instead they relied on the efficiency of communication. Vikings had excellent communication, but not so great formations. But what made them so successful was not only their communication that was so effective, but also the fact that they relied on surprise attacks. They could go in small bands and raid a village before reinforcements came along, and they would board into these villages using formations such as the wedge formation, where the berserkers and the crazed maniacs would be on the front lines, throwing spears at targets and entering into a hand-to-hand combat once they got close by. Berserkers were Viking warriors that were believed to be immune to pain and injuries, and this is what basically influenced them to do so well on the battlefield. Brings us to the psychological warfare that they have. Vikings followed a pagan mythology, pagan religions, and within their religions it had a heavy influence on how they perceive things around them. Vikings were fearsome. They entered trances before they even got onto the battlefield, and these trances basically had a mental effect on their brain, making them perform immaculately better than the average soldier. Vikings entered this trance state, which basically made everything around them much more bare bone. They could focus, but this type of focus was more barbaric than the average human being. Vikings are portrayed as these barbaric men that are utterly insane, but what led to that insanity was their religion and the trances that they got on them. It had a heavy influence, what their beliefs were, on them as an individual, which gave them a psychological asset when it came to the battlefield. The specific types of ships which were most popular for Vikings were the longships. The longships had mobility to sail past the horizon of a bay. They traveled in small bands, like I just said, and it assisted them with the element of surprise. Now, I know I mention ships a lot, but it's important to understand the value that ships play in every attack strategy of a Viking raid. They have another worry on their hand. If the attack becomes too slow, they have to worry about reinforcements arriving and utterly murdering them because they are in a smaller band. So what a Viking ship, a long one essentially, what it allows them is to have a quick hit and run, in other words. They could do what they need to do, and if they do bad in it, they have a way back. The communication was also a very valuable thing. We learned that Vikings did not have the best, strategic formations. They only stuck to the wedge formation specifically for raids, but their communication was often something that was favored. They had excellent communication. This gives us a sense of a more naturalistic, unconventional warfare, because these men did not use the element of formations and real strategy to their advantage. Instead, they relied on the element of surprise, attacking in small bands and finding small objectives to take down together. Just like any raid and any warfare, weapons are an essential. Vikings were notorious for using battle axes. This ranged from the broad axes that were used for both raiding and for farming to the more simplistic Danish axes that were all over a meter in length. These axes had a wooden shaft with a large curved iron blade, and they required less swinging power, which made them even more potent and effective in combat. So battle axes were really essential because of the simplicity of them, especially the Danish axes. Instead of having this heavy weapon, it's going to make things a lot difficult and slow things down, because Vikings worked at a fast pace when it came to raiding. They had to get in and get out. So having heavy weapons wouldn't help you. It would actually put you a bit at a disadvantage. Surely you'll be able to kill your enemy, but what's better, killing your enemy slowly or killing your enemy fast? In this case, fast was always better, which meant that Danish axes assisted them greatly. Just as any middle-aged battle goes, swords were often a necessity for all battles. However, Viking Age swords were just as common as battle axes and spears. While there were many variations of swords, the Viking swords that they mainly used were double-edged swords. They were 90 centimeters in length and about 15 centimeters in width. These swords were specifically designed for slashing your victim and cutting rather than the traditional thrusting, so the blades were carefully sharpened by the tip and were often left relatively dull. So we can even see, if you take notice, that the actual overall design of Viking weapons were designed in a much more ruthless, much more uncommon manner than the classic medieval swords. Last but not least is a spear. The spear was not as prevalent as swords and battle axes, but were commonly used in the Viking Age. These spears were inexpensive and effective, so because of Vikings, their lives being not as, how can I say, wealthy as you can imagine, because Vikings were typically traders and farmers, like we said. So spears were generally an easy go-to weapon for winning in battles and things like that. They were cheap, they were effective, and most importantly, they were easy to make. But they were also very, very handy when it came to the battle. You could throw them, you could use them. They were a multi-purpose weapon that greatly assisted Vikings in warfare. With the video coming to an end, I hope I was able to squeeze as much information in a short period of time as possible. If you guys want me to do another type of video, let me know down in the description, down in the comment section, your opinion, what videos you want to see, and I hope everyone enjoyed the video and have a lovely day further. Goodbye.